welcome, especially to our foreign visitors. Right? Very honored. Take a drink, everybody, please. There's seltzers there. The shir is both for the Refuah Shlema, for Alex Clare, Yosef Alexander Zusha and Sarah, who broke his leg last week. He's the kind of engine behind the shul and behind the shir. And Ilui Nishmas Mika Basayal, a very special young lady who unfortunately passed away about a week ago. Okay, we're at the very end of Parshas Bamidbar, a Sefer Bamidbar, Parshas Masei, the concept of the travels. Okay, and as we'll see in a second, the Shem Mishmuel points out that in this list of places, they're all called Masei, their travels. It's not called their stops. Right? Usually, if you would give the itinerary, where'd you go on your trip? Oh, we spent a day in Edinburgh, we spent a day in Glasgow, and we went up to Loch Ness or something, just using our Scottish examples today. Right? So here, it only talks about the travels between, where they went to and from. Now, the pasuk that so many commentaries work on is pasuk Beis, which gives a very strange double lashon. It says, "Vayichtov Moshe es motza'ehem lemaseihem." Moshe wrote down their goings from to their travels, al pi Hashem, ve'ele maseihem lemotza'ehem, and these are their travels to their leaving places. Very confusing pasuk. Let's try to take it into pieces. The Shem Mishmuel says Motzah is really a source, where you go out from. Okay, the Malbim, he points to a pasuk in Eov, where the Malbim explains that the reason a source is called a Motzah is usually it has to be found. Right? At one point when I was a kid, I watched this long series called The Search for the Source of the Nile. Right? That was where Stanley and Livingston went into Africa to try and find where the Nile actually comes from. He says the source of something is often hidden and has to be found. That's why it's called a motzah. Okay, but that's the place where you're coming out of, but it's a starting point on a travel. Okay, motza'ehem, lemaseihem, right, on their travel that they went to. And then it switches back, right, the other way, maseihem lemotza'ehem. So what's going on? So the Shem Mishmuel explains in the following way. It says, when it lists the different things, it always says they traveled and they camped. Vayis'u, vayachanu. Now, the vayachanu is the equivalent of the motzah. That means every time they camped, it was really a stage of the beginning of the next journey. It was never a stop in and of itself. And here's the way he describes this so beautifully. The travels in the Midbar, when we think, how did they get to these travels? Why were they traveling? We have to think back to Parshas Shlach. They were on their way to Eretz Yisrael. All of these travels in the Midbar weren't supposed to happen. It was because something went wrong, and we weren't prepared to go into Eretz Yisrael. They had to go through these trips in order to get themselves back to the state of spiritual health and readiness to be able to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's why Rashi, quoting the Medrash Tanchuma in the beginning, says a fascinating thing. He says, Moshel lemelech shaya beno choleh, it's a parable to a king whose son was sick, v'olichol lemakom rachok l'rapoto, and he took him to a faraway place to heal him. Kivan shayu chozrin, when they were returning, his father started counting all the trips. Amar lo, he said, kan yoshanenu, here we slept, kan hokarnu, here you were cold, kan chashashta roshcha, here you had a headache. Now what's strange about that is, it sounds to us in our mind, in the mashal, that there was a hospital someplace, and the king had to take his son to this hospital to heal him. But that doesn't seem to fit with what's happening in the Midbar. There was no particular place of healing that he was taking them to. instead what was happening is that the trip itself was the healing. He had to take him on a far distance in order to heal him. And each of those stages and difficulties that were there were part of that healing process. And it was something that they did together. That's why it's the plural lashon in the Midrash. Kam yashanu, here we slept, right? Here it was cold for us. Here it was done out of love, and that's what's happening. The English connotations of the translations are often very misleading. They'll describe the Jews wandering in the desert. They weren't wandering, it was all extremely intentional. That's why these things are listed. If they were simply wandering, there was a punishment. You have to wander, right, for all these years until you can go into Israel. Who cares where they were, right? But here it was intentional. Each place that they went, each step of the journey was important, not just for them at the moment, but like all things that were happening in that generation, for the future of the Jewish people. So he says, what was happening in these places? He said, each place they went, there was another challenge. Each place they went, the Zohar HaKadosh says that these journeys, and it says in all the Hasidic reframes, quote this as well, that everybody in their life goes through 42 journeys, just like the Jewish people went through in the Midbar. We all have to go through these 42 journeys, and these 42 journeys that they took encompass all types of journeys and challenges that a person has and will meet. And they bring in the Polish Hasidus, they bring from the Kotzker and from others that a sefer is going to be written about every individual's 42 journeys. That's, like, I heard someone quoting, I didn't see it inside from the Rimanover, he said, and you'll be able to make a bracha on that book like on the Torah. That's the story of your implementation of Torah in life, is your 42 journeys. And in each place that you are, there was something difficult. We think the desert is just, one blob. They're wandering in the Sinai desert. But there was a name for each place. And he said each place, the Zohar HaKadosh says they were supposed to be overcoming an aspect of the Yetzer Hara. He said when they overcame that aspect in that place, okay, and again, the overcoming wasn't easy. Many of the names, as is pointed out, had to do with mistakes that the Jews made. Places where they failed, but they got up after their failure. He says, when they defeated what they had to in that place, he said, "B'koch kedushasam, torasam, v'avodosam," in the power of their kedusha and Torah and avodah, they overcame one detail of the opposing force. Then they camped. That's what's called camping. It was a battle, and they fought against it, and they camped. That was Chanoyah. Now, when they camped, the whole purpose was to consolidate what they gained from that battle, and then to go on further, right? Even though, let's say, they defeated a certain challenge, a certain aspect of the Yetzer Hara in that place, even to the extent that it wasn't bothering them anymore. I want to just mention parenthetically something important. Rosh Hashiva Varan Shechter Shlita once was discussing the concept of an isayon, and he spoke about this idea of this certain rest that's described here in the Shem Mishmuel, that a person can overcome a test and then it doesn't bother you anymore. You've achieved that. And afterwards I spoke to him privately and I said there were certain tests that I had that I, so to speak, passed, but they still bother me. Sometimes going back, I almost wish I would have failed or something. What is that? Why shouldn't it be if I pass that I move on? And he said that's the aspect of Yaakov Tzoleya al Yerecha. Yaakov Avinu fought the Sar of Esav and was victorious, but he was wounded, and it took time to heal. He said you can be victorious in a battle, but sometimes there's damage, and you're wounded, and that takes time to heal. Now, here they defeated something in one place. The entire point of the exercise was you've now gained through that battle. You've now gained new understanding, new strength. Now you have to move forward to your next challenge. That's why every chanaya, every camping was called a motzah, a launching place for the next journey, because they understood that that's what it's all about, and that's the point of it. So he says they wanted to get from that chanaya the ability to go on, and then when the next battle is going to be different, He says they would have to fight Tzad Hara B'Prat Achera Yoter Gavoa. The battle with the opposing side, with the Tzad Hara, is now going to be on a higher plane. Right? This refers to what he describes. Chazal say, "Kodol Godol Mechaveru," whoever's greater than his friend, Yitzro Godol Himenu. His Yetzer, his evil inclination, is greater. So when I was a kid and I heard that, I thought, oh, so does that mean that if I want to watch movie X, so the great Rabbi so-and-so really, really, really wants to watch that movie even more than I can imagine? That's not what it means. What it means is that there are more subtle, more difficult challenges that are there in that next plane, right? In a different way. So he says, this is what you're building up to. And we have to embrace that as a picture of life. That idea that our life is these 42 journeys means that life is not really about resting. And this has to bring about a whole rethink of Judaism for us. A lot of times we're trying to look and see, okay, what have I done? Am I finished with this? I've checked this off the list. I've checked that. Sometimes even during the day, a person likes to say, okay, what's my little list of obligations? I davened what I was supposed to. I gave some tzedakah. I did this. It's Rosh Chodesh. I didn't forget Yalav Yova. I don't have to go back. I'm done. Right? Now I can rest. The picture is one of constant movement. The description Chazal gives says tzadikim, or Talmidei Chachamim, it says in Masei reframes, Ein lehem menucha lo ba'olam hazeh v'lo ba'olam haba. They have no rest in this world or in the next world. Okay, now, isn't that exhausting? What it means to say is it's not menucha for menucha's sake. It's not resting in order to rest. Every resting which is there is in order to build up strength to do. Okay, it's interesting that you must understand and embrace the idea that that type of menucha, which is part of the travel, is essential. Okay, sometimes people are shocked by the concept of what's called bein hazmanim, vacations that were instituted in the yeshiva's schedule. How can that be? There's no, particular change in the Torah's obligation to study Torah in particular months of the summer or other times. But the idea is vayachanu v'yisol. You have to do this. I was reading recently the memoirs of Rabbi Yitzchak Tuv Yovai Shlita. You should have a refuah shlema. He's now the Av Beis Din of the Haredis, who was originally from Czechoslovakia, and he managed to escape on the kinder transport to England during the war. And he was in London during the Blitz in what was called Schneider's Yeshiva. It was a yeshiva which was there in London. And a couple of times where Schneider sent him to rest someplace. One time he and a friend to Letchworth, which was the home of the Sassoon family, a very fascinating home of Torah and Chesed, a famous Iraqi family, came from India to England, and there many Talmidei Chachamim came and spent time in that place. Sassoon had Rav Dessler tutor his children, his son and daughter. So there was a very special place. And he was a little surprised that Rabbi Schneider sent him out, but afterwards he realized it was necessary. During the Blitz, he said, there was one point where a bomb fell about 50 meters from where he was. Like he could hear that shriek of the bomb falling, and he ran, and it just missed him. And then he really had now what we would recognize as PTSD, as trauma, that he just couldn't. And so Schneider sent him to Gateshead for a year to rest. There is an idea, certainly, of rest being important. When it says tzadikim ein lehem menucha lo ba'olam hazeh v'olam haba, it means the type of menucha which is there for itself, not as part of continuing on and going on. And what you do get is more strength. Each stage actually gives you more strength. Kovei Hashem yachlifu koach. Those who hope for Hashem, it says, they exchange their power. They get a new source of energy. Each travel, each struggle gives you something else that enables you to go on. He says this is really what happens with the weekdays and Shabbos. The weekdays are days of struggle. Shabbos being menucha is not simply a day that, okay, great, you can just tune out and chill out or whatever it is. Shabbos is a day in which you consolidate all of those gains from the week, and that prepares you for the challenges of the next week. Now he asks an interesting question. Halachically, you're not supposed to be preparing for the next week on Shabbos. How can you do that? He says it happens naturally. He says it's there, and you will receive that new strength in order to do it. He says this is motza'ehem l'maseihem. This is the idea that every stopping point was actually the beginning of the next journey. That is the picture of who and what we are and the Jewish people. And we go from place to place in this way. The Sfas Emes in Lech Lecha says that Avram Avinu, looking at the universe, he was shocked. He described it as a bira doleket. That's what it says in the Midrash. This burning castle. Now, there are a variety of translations of the word doleket. He brings from the Chidush Yarim, from his grandfather, one that it means running. Yaakov Avinu said to Lavan, Lama dolakta acharai. Right? Why did you run after me? What Avram Avinu said is, if you have a universe which was designed with such wisdom and such chesed even that could be sensed there, shouldn't everything be in its place of menucha? Shouldn't everything be at rest and comfortable? Why is it? And Hashem appeared to him and said, Ani Bal Habira. I am the master of the universe and I made it this way. He says, because the world is about this constant work, not rest in terms of that. Okay, so this is what and who we are and how we're supposed to go, on and on. And it's important to realize that every experience, even the difficult ones, are meant to be leading you on to the next thing. There was a powerful story that I saw connected to this week's Parsha. We have in this week's Parsha the concept of the Ori Miklat, cities of refuge, for someone who killed someone else by accident. Right? The Gemara in Makos goes into the exact definition. Right? It's not too much negligence, but it's not what's called onus, something that a person had absolutely no control on. And he has to go in what's called golus. He has to go into exile. He has to move and live in a different place. So there was a story of a man, and unfortunately sometimes these things happen. He was driving, and really through no fault of his own, that's the way I saw it described, a child just ran out suddenly into the street. And unfortunately the child was killed. And the man was crushed. For the first 2 months afterwards, he wouldn't move out of his house. He wouldn't do anything. He eventually went to some rabbi who told him, he says, I think that to atone for this, you have to travel someplace where no one knows you, and you have to travel from place to place. You have to take golus upon yourself. You have to take upon yourself exile, similar to what was done then. Before he did this, he went to speak to the Ger Rebbe, the Pnei Menachem, of Pinchas Menachem Alter. And the Ger Rebbe listened to this, and he said, you have a wife? He said, yes. You have children? He said, yes. He said, what will be accomplished by killing more people? He says, what will be accomplished by going on this journey and not taking care of those people who are there for you to take care of? He says, that's your first priority in terms of repairing and doing. If you want to take your energy for something else, look for young people that are struggling, that need a helping hand, that need some warmth, and try to draw them close. That's what you should be doing. It should be energy toward a positive journey. It shouldn't be an idea of simply punishment or self-punishment that is going to not only bring damage to you, but bring damage to those people that are who you're supposed to be helping. You have to look at what Hashem wants you to do now in your next journey. So these are really two visions of Judaism. Are we trying to just check off the different things we have to do on the list so that we can be done with it and then do what we want and relax? Or is this an all-encompassing journey, and we realize that each experience we go through is there to prepare us for the next one? And it goes on and on. Now, on one hand, that seems exhausting, but you also have to realize that makes life itself meaningful, and there's no particular point that you have to get to per se. The point is, by going through all of your different travels, and you have to embrace those different travels that oftentimes take you to difficult places or places that you didn't want to be, and yet, as Rashi says there from the Tanchuma, Hashem is with you in all of those travels. You're not traveling alone. He's going with you. Now, there's a fascinating piece in the Shem Mishmuel that he gave in one of the last years that he was speaking. He said, Chazal bring, right, in the Medrash, this is brought in the Medrash Rabbah in the beginning of Parshas Shmos, that there were 3 gifts that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to Am Yisroel, and all of them were only given through Yisurim, through dealing with difficulties. Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba, right, that eternal world. And they bring psukim to show it. Now he says, Yisurim doesn't mean random torture. Right? Before you can get this, you have to suffer. Yisurim refers to a preparatory stage, something that you have to go to that's transformative, enables you to be the person who can experience what you're supposed to experience. That was what was happening with these 42 travels in the desert. They were supposed to live in Eretz Yisrael. They were supposed to be able to enter Eretz Yisrael the way they were meant to be able to build the Beis HaMikdash, to have everything that was supposed to be there. And this journey was necessary for them to be able to do this. So he says, just like the time spent in Mitzrayim was the preparation for being able to receive the Torah, he says, so too these travels in the desert were necessary for them to be able to merit Eretz Yisrael. This is written specifically in the Torah. It says, right, Vayancho vayariveko in Sefer Dvarim, Hashem brought you through these difficulties of famine, right, the idea of only eating the man, they said. V'yadatim levavecha, and you have to know in your heart, ki kasher yaser ishet b'no Hashem elokecha miyasreka. You have to know that any of this difficulty that Hashem is putting you through is like the difficulty that a parent puts the child through. He says, and immediately afterwards it says, Ki Hashem elokecha meviachol eretz tova, because Hashem is bringing you to a good land. Meaning those two things are linked. This is all preparing you, enabling you to be able to be where you're supposed to be and do that which you're supposed to do. So he said, the Kotzker Rebbe, right, this is somewhat what I referred to before, his grandfather said, that all of the events of the Golus, all of these thousands of years that we've been going through, Nichtevu b'shamayim, they're all written down in the Shamayim, not just in a general national sense. Every single individual Jew, what they went through. And there will be a book that's going to be made of all of those. Now he says, there are different ways of accessing Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is revealed in the world in different ways. He says, we see that those years in the desert were necessary for them to enter Eretz Yisrael in that way. And there they had Eretz Yisrael with the Beis HaMikdash, they had Nevuah, they had all of these things. But he says, try to think about what we're going through. He says, the Al Achas Kama V'Kama, Golus Zu, this Golus that Am Yisroel is going through, Arichus Azman, the amount of time that it's been, Vatzaras, the difficulties, Vagerushim Vatiltulin, the exiles that Jews went through from country to country to country, going from place to place. Kol zehu achona le'Eretz Yisrael. All of this is a preparation for Eretz Yisrael being settled and rebuilt in the future the way it's supposed to be. Right? So what, maybe echoing what Nachman of Breslov used to say, Chol makom asher ani olech le'Eretz Yisrael. Every place I'm walking to Eretz Yisrael. Every step, every Jew took in the world, through every place that they are, we're all heading towards that. As I mentioned in the previous year, this idea of pointing towards Eretz Yisrael when we daven is not simply nostalgia for the homeland. It really is a real destination, and we're always in a state of travel towards it. So he says, if we've been doing this for so many years with so much difficulty, ma ma'od tigdal ma'alosa, he says, who can even imagine what that existence of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael will be? Ad she'ein hapeh yochel ledaber v'alev lachshov. He says the mouth cannot express it, the heart cannot grasp it. He says Hashem yizakenu l'rosa b'vinyon mehir. He says may we merit to see that soon. Okay, so he says this is the travel to Eretz Yisrael that's done. And he said that Olam Haba, he says, and again he emphasizes here from the Chidush Yarim, what I always said, that the mistranslation of Olam Haba, that the world to come, right? That's very wrong. It's the world that comes, right? It's the world that is parallel and resulting from our world, right? This is why the Medrash says in Parshas Chukas, Mitin tahor mitamei lo echad. Who brings the pure from the impure? Only that one, Hashem. That means he brings Olam Haba me Olam Hazeh. Olam Haba, it's the world that comes, ongoing present tense, from this world. How? He says, because what's happening is constant attacks in the world of machshava, in your world of thoughts. He says, in this world, you can end up forgetting the big picture, forgetting what life is about. And the more a person is able to remember those things and to get that clear picture, then a person reaches that concept of Olam Haba. He says this is really what's happening. That's why Shabbos is called Me'ein Olam Haba. Right? It says Shabbos is like a taste of Olam Haba. Why in Olam Haba you sleep and eat chont? I don't know, maybe. Right? But the Me'ein Olam Haba is part of the real difficult avodah on Shabbos is focusing your thoughts. That idea of focusing on what life is really about, what's important and what's not important. That's really our portion of what we're doing on Shabbos. And everybody who's had a difficult week, the past week, and is looking towards a difficult week coming, knows how difficult that is to fight off those thoughts on Shabbos. He says that's why it's a Me'ein Olam Haba. And he says this is something that everybody goes through. And that's why Chazal said, Kol tzadik v'tzadik yesh lo olam b'fnei atzmo. Everybody's Olam Haba is individual. It's something, they like to use the word now, crafted. It's something which is individually crafted by you in your lifetime. That's what's happening and that's what you're doing. So he says this is why it's so important to talk about these travels. He says it's not just to let us know historically what Am Yisroel went through. He said, Gam ala osid. This is there to teach us about the future. L'chazek et lev Yisrael, to strengthen the hearts of Am Yisroel, shelo yipol libam aleim ba'orech v'tzar hagolus. They should not become disheartened in this long and painful golus. And there have been, throughout history, many, many people on the sides trying to make us disheartened through that. And he says, Mura al malas Eretz Yisrael la'asid. And he says, each time that there's more and more travel, and each time that you think that you've reached the resting point, and you realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has more challenges for you to come, and more things, he says, that's simply teaching you Mailas Eretz Yisrael La'asid, what you're heading towards, right? What you're preparing for. If you want to take a small comparison, maybe there's a person who prepares to get a pilot's license for a small private plane. And there's a person who prepares to get a pilot's license to be able to fly a commercial jet. A person who gets training to fly a supersonic fighter plane, and then a person who trains to be an astronaut, right? Each of them has to go through much more preparation depending on that which they're heading towards. He says, Am Yisroel are heading towards something of a magnitude that we can't even imagine. So he says, therefore, he says, V'chein gam al tirdat ha'machshavot. And this is a fascinating aspect of Golus that we don't think about. The world of your thoughts. Right? Golus, we tend to think about difficulties. There can be anti-Semitism. There can be all sorts of things like that. He says, but it affects the world of your thoughts. What you can think about, what you feel, what you don't feel. And he says, Lo yitmuhu v'lo yobritzu tachat masa'am. He says, don't let those thoughts crush you. Don't let them break you and get you down. It's true. There are many difficult things and worries and questions that you don't have answers for. He says, Hakol l'to'elet nifla. All of those things are there for a tremendous goal. Hakol nirmaz b'sipur masal ta'elu. And everything is hinted to in the story of these 42 journeys. So this is us. This is our lives. And we're supposed to look at this miniature and to see and have this picture. On one hand, it seems exhausting. You have to keep traveling. Every time you get to rest, you're supposed to be planning what you're doing next and seeing. On the other hand, it's exhilarating. Life is always full of meaning. Life is always traveling towards someplace and getting a goal, right? And that's a beautiful picture of what a person has in Judaism. No matter where you are, and let's remember also sometimes some of the trips listed were where Am Yisroel went backwards. And sometimes you have to go backwards in order to go forwards. And that also becomes part of the journey. Right? That's also what's there. And some of the journeys they went, they failed and they got up again. Also part of it. In all of those, it's Hashem going with us, the king who wanted to heal his child, as we're in the 3 weeks. And Chaim Friedlander brought down the question. It sounds kind of chutzpahdik. If you would ask it, you say, okay, so the Jewish people were living in Israel. They had a Beis HaMikdash, and they were not behaving the way Hashem wanted. So you're going to destroy the Beis HaMikdash and throw us out of Israel to be scattered among the nations. Is that really going to help? How's that going to make things better? It requires the eyes to see that that's a healing journey. That journey is there to heal. At that point, we couldn't remain in Eretz Yisrael. It would have been negative for us. And the journey that we're on, even as we're there on Tisha B'Av, as we mentioned, the first night of Pesach, the Leila Seder, always comes out in our set calendar the same night that Tisha B'Av does. Because it's two sides of the same coin. Just as Hashem took us out of Egypt in order to be able to come to Eretz Yisrael, Hashem took us on this journey as well, which began on Tisha B'Av, and it's still going on for us in order to be able to head back. And as the Shem Mishmuel said so beautifully, he says, Hashem is zakenu l'rotav v'vinyana b'mehira. We should be able to see this soon, but to know that even now, even there, it's there with us, and to feel that energy and anticipation of knowing that we're not the wandering Jew, but we're the traveling Jew. Two different ways of looking at that same journey that we have. A wonderful night, wonderful week.